The wind didn't just blow across the high plains of the Montana Territory. It hunted. It sought out the gaps in rough-hewn log walls, the seams in bison leather coats, and the hollow spaces in a grieving man's chest. For Thorne, a rancher who had spent the last 5 years cultivating solitude as if it were a crop, the winter of 1886 was less a season and more a judgment. The snow had fallen for 3 days straight, erasing the definition of the world, turning the rugged horizon into a blank, suffocating sheet of white. He was miles from the nearest settlement, riding his gelding, Dutch, along the northern fence line, checking for breaks that might let his meager herd drift into the canyons where the wolves waited. The air was so cold it tasted metallic, burning the lungs with every inhalation, a reminder that in this country, life was a fragile exception to the rule of frozen silence. Thorne squinted against the glare, his beard crusted with ice, looking for the dark, jagged line of cedar posts. Instead, he saw a disruption in the pristine white pattern, something that didn't belong to the geometry of nature. It looked like a stain of ash against the snowbank, a pile of discarded gray fabric half buried in a drift near the tree line. Dutch snorted, sidestepping nervously, his hooves crunching loudly on the ice-crusted powder. Thorne reined him in, his gloved hand instinctively dropping to the stock of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. Out here, traps were common, and mercy was often a bait used by road agents. But the shape was too still, too small in the vastness of the landscape to be a threat. He nudged the horse forward, the leather of his saddle creaking in the stillness. As he drew closer, the pile of gray resolved into shapes, human shapes, 2 of them. They were huddled together in a desperate, tangled embrace, their limbs interlocked as if trying to share the last fading warmth of their blood. Before we descend further into this harrowing rescue, I have to ask, have you ever witnessed a miracle born from absolute tragedy? If you believe in the power of second chances, make sure to subscribe as we witness this journey unfold. Thorne dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the drift. The wind howled, a mournful, shrieking sound that seemed to urge him to turn back, to leave the dead to the winter. He reached them. They were women, not children as he had initially feared, though malnutrition had sharpened their features. They wore identical gray cheongsams, the silk thin and utterly useless against the brutality of the American West, embroidered with fading patterns that spoke of a life thousands of miles away. They looked to be in their mid-20s, their skin turned a terrifying shade of blue-gray that matched their garments. Thorne knelt, the cold seeping instantly through the knees of his trousers. He reached out, brushing the snow from the face of the one nearest him. Her eyes were frozen shut, her breathing so shallow it didn't even miss the air. He touched her neck, searching for the thrum of life. It was there, faint, fluttering, a terrified bird trapped in a cage of ice. "Damn it," Thorne hissed, the sound swallowed by the gale. He wasn't a savior. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone. But looking at them, abandoned and left to turn into statues in the wilderness, the old instinct to protect, the one he thought he buried with his wife, clawed its way up his throat. The physical mechanics of saving a life are rarely graceful. They are heavy, clumsy, and exhausted. Thorne had to pry them apart, their frozen clothing having fused together where the snow had melted and refrozen. The first woman, the one he had checked, was dead weight in his arms as he lifted her. He stumbled through the drifts, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the altitude and the cold conspiring to sap his strength. He managed to hoist her over the saddle of his horse, Dutch whinnying in protest at the sudden burden and the smell of impending death. Thorne didn't have time to soothe the animal. He turned back for the second woman. She seemed slightly smaller, her hands still reaching out toward where her sister had lain, fingers curled into a claw. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and he saw the striking, uncanny resemblance. Identical twins. In this superstitious country, folks might have called them a curse or an omen. To Thorne, they were just heavy. Every step back to the horse was a battle against the physics of the storm. He mounted behind the saddle, keeping the women balanced across the horse's withers, an awkward and perilous arrangement. He wrapped his heavy buffalo coat around them as best he could, exposing himself to the biting wind, his own shirt offering little protection. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of numbness. Thorne couldn't feel his fingers. He couldn't feel his toes. His mind began to drift, the white landscape triggering memories he kept locked behind iron doors. The fever that took Clara, the empty crib, the silence of a house that was meant to be full of noise. He shook his head violently, forcing himself to focus on the rhythmic crunch of hooves. "Stay with me," he grunted, though whether he was talking to the women, the horse, or himself, he wasn't sure. The gray silk of their dresses whipped in the wind, a stark contrast to the rough leather and wool of the frontier. Who were they? Why were they here, miles from the railroad camps, dressed in the finery of the old world? The questions were distractions, keeping his mind active as his body slowly froze. By the time the dark outline of his cabin emerged from the swirling white, Thorne was hallucinating warmth. He slid off the horse, his legs buckling as they hit the ground. He had to drag them inside, one by one. The cabin was dark, the fire having burned down to embers in his absence. He kicked the door shut against the howling wind, plunging the room into a sudden, ringing silence. He dragged the women to the hearth, his movements stiff and robotic. He stoked the fire, feeding it kindling with shaking hands until the flames roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He stripped the gloves from his hands, wincing as the blood rushed back into his fingertips with the sting of 1,000 needles. He needed help. He needed Garrick. The old hand was in the bunkhouse 50 yards away, but in this storm it might as well have been 50 miles. Thorne grabbed a heavy iron pot, filled it with snow, and set it on the hook over the fire. He had to work fast. Frostbite, hypothermia, shock. The rule of 3. Grief, terror, rage. He pushed the thoughts away. He pulled the buffalo coat off them and began to chafe their hands, trying to generate friction, trying to call the blood back from the core. The transition from the void of the storm to the sanctuary of the cabin was violent. The air in the room grew heavy with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of ozone that clung to their clothes. Thorne worked tirelessly, moving between the two women, rubbing their limbs, wrapping them in every blanket he owned. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and Garrick stumbled in, a gust of snow following him like a persistent ghost. The old man was bundled in furs, his face a map of wrinkles and windburn. "Saw the horse," Garrick rasped, kicking the door shut. "Thought you'd frozen to the saddle, Thorne. What in the hell is—" He stopped dead, his eyes adjusting to the firelight, landing on the two figures on the floor. The gray silk shimmered in the orange glow. "Lord Almighty," Garrick whispered, pulling his hat off, revealing a shock of white hair. "Where did you find them?" "Fence line, North Ridge," Thorne said, not looking up, his hands busy massaging the feet of the first sister. "They were dumped, Garrick. Left like trash." Garrick moved quickly then, his age forgotten. He knelt on the other side, his rough hands gentle as he checked pulses. "They're barely here," Garrick muttered. "Skin's like marble. We need warm water, not hot. Don't want to shock the heart." The two men worked in a rhythm born of years of managing livestock and weathering crises together. They were efficient, silent, communicating with nods and gestures. They heated stones near the fire and wrapped them in cloth, placing them at the women's feet and sides. Hours bled into the night. The storm raged outside, pounding against the roof, demanding entry, but the cabin held. It was the first sister, the one Thorne had carried first, who stirred. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure agony as the feeling returned to her nerves. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, terrified, unfocused. She scrambled backward, crab-walking across the rough wooden floor, her breath coming in hyperventilating gasps. She slammed into the leg of the heavy oak table and curled into a ball, eyes darting between Thorn and Garrick. Thorn raised his hands slowly, palms open. "Easy," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "You're safe. Safe." The woman didn't seem to understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her eyes locked onto the other figure on the floor. She let out a cry, a sharp, piercing word in a language Thorn didn't know, and scrambled toward her sister, covering her body with her own, glaring at the men with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. This was May, and even half dead, she was ready to kill to protect the other. The days that followed were a blur of steam, broth, and suspicion. The storm broke on the third day, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of diamond dust snow. The twins, May and Lan, occupied the main room of the cabin, while Thorn and Garrick retreated to the bunkhouse for sleep, giving the women privacy. It was a slow, agonizing thaw. Lan, the second sister, was weaker. The cold had settled deeper into her chest, and she spent the first week drifting in and out of fever dreams, coughing a dry, hacking sound that made Thorn flinch. May never left her side. She was the vigilant guardian, watching Thorn with eyes that assessed every movement for a threat. She spoke little, and when she did, it was in whispered Cantonese to her sister. The language barrier was a wall, but actions spoke loudly. Thorn saw how May divided the meager food he brought them, always giving the larger portion to Lan. He saw how she checked the windows, not looking at the view, but checking the locks. "They're running from something worse than the weather," Garrick observed one evening, whittling a piece of kindling into shavings for the fire. He and Thorn were sitting on the porch, the cold air crisp and clear. "You see the way the healthy one, May, looks at the door? She expects someone to kick it in." Thorn nodded, nursing a tin cup of coffee. "They were wearing silk in a blizzard, Garrick. No coats, no supplies. Someone drove them out there and pushed them off a wagon." The injustice of it sat heavy in Thorn's gut. He was a man who believed in a hard code. You work for what you get, and you take care of your own. Abandonment was a sin he couldn't reconcile. Inside the cabin, the dynamic began to shift. As Lan's fever broke and her strength returned, the fear began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity. They weren't helpless. Once they could stand, they refused to be idle. It started small. Thorn would come in from feeding the cattle to find the floor swept clean, the hearth scrubbed of ash. He would find his torn work shirts mended with impeccable tiny stitches, the thread pulled from the hem of their ruined cheongsams. They didn't ask for permission. They just worked. It was their currency, their way of paying for the space they took up. One evening, Thorn returned to the smell of cooking that wasn't Garrick's burnt stew. May had found a sack of rice and some dried herbs in the pantry. She had transformed the bland staples into a porridge that smelled of comfort and home. When Thorn entered, May froze, the ladle in her hand trembling slightly. She looked at him, then at the pot, waiting for a reprimand. Thorn walked over, took the ladle gently from her hand, and poured himself a bowl. He took a bite, the warmth spreading through him. He looked at her and nodded. "Good," he said simply. "It's good." May's shoulders dropped an inch. It was the first bridge built. That night, after dinner, the silence was broken not by wind, but by a voice. Lan, sitting by the fire, looked up at Thorn. Her English was broken, heavily accented, but clear. "Why?" she asked. Thorn looked at her, confused. "Why what?" Lan gestured to the fire, the food, the blankets. "Why you stop? Why you keep us?" Thorn looked into the fire. He saw the gray shapes in the snow again. He saw the vulnerability that mirrored his own internal desolation. "Because," Thorn said, his voice low, "nobody deserves to be left behind." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. May looked at Thorn, really looked at him for the first time, not as a captor, but as a man carrying a heavy load. Suddenly, the tears that she had held back during the freezing cold, during the rescue, during the fever, broke loose. "Please don't leave us," she sobbed, the phrase tumbling out, a repetition of the plea she must have screamed into the forest when the wagon drove away. "Please don't leave us." Thorne stood up, feeling awkward and large in the small room. He didn't know how to comfort them with touch, so he comforted them with a promise. He walked to the door and bolted it. "I ain't going anywhere," he said firmly, "and neither are you. Not until you want to." Weeks turned into a month. The winter held its grip, but the ranch became a fortress against it. The twins shed the rags of their chongsams for altered trousers and flannel shirts provided by Garrick. They learned to handle the livestock, their movements fluid and precise. May had a natural affinity for the horses. She could calm Dutch with a touch that Thorne envied. Lan, though physically frailer, possessed a sharp mind. She organized the pantry, rationed the supplies, and even began to understand the ledger book Thorne kept on the mantel. They were becoming part of the rhythm of the ranch, a found family forged in the crucible of survival. But the snow was melting, the passes were clearing, and with the spring thaw came the opening of the roads, bringing the outside world back to their doorstep. Thorne knew it couldn't last. The isolation was a shield, and it was thinning. He rode into the nearest town, a muddy collection of shacks and saloons called Oakhaven, to pick up supplies. The atmosphere in the town was tense. The railroad was expanding, bringing with it money, corruption, and men who viewed the law as a suggestion. As Thorne loaded sacks of flour onto his wagon, he felt eyes on him. He turned to see Mayor Halloway standing on the boardwalk, flanked by two men wearing long dusters. Halloway was a man of soft hands and hard eyes, a bureaucrat who had carved a fiefdom out of the territory. "Thorne," Halloway called out, his voice oily and smooth. "Rare to see you down from the mountain, especially with extra mouths to feed." Thorne stiffened, his hand resting near his hip. "I mind my business, Halloway. You should try it." The mayor stepped down into the mud, smiling without warmth. "Word travels, even in winter. Peddlers say you picked up some stray baggage. Chinese baggage." The racial slur hung in the air, toxic and deliberate. "That clan they belong to? They have strict rules, dealing with bad luck. They paid good money to have that luck removed." Thorne stepped forward, towering over the mayor. "They aren't baggage, and they aren't luck. They're my help." Halloway chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Careful, rancher. You're holding on to stolen property, and the owners, they're coming to collect. You might want to rethink your hospitality before the snow clears completely." Thorne didn't reply. He climbed onto his wagon, snapped the reins, and drove out of town, his heart hammering against his ribs. The threat was real. The clan, or whoever had paid to dispose of the twins, knew they were alive. The peaceful interlude of the winter was over. He wasn't just fighting the elements anymore. He was fighting a system that viewed May and Lan as disposable commodities. As he rode back up the trail, the sun setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, Thorne made a choice. He had failed to save his wife from the fever. He had failed to save his daughter from the harshness of this life. But he would burn this ranch to the ground before he let anyone take these women back to the darkness they had escaped. The reluctant protector was reluctant no more. He was a wall, and the storm was coming. Thorne drove the wagon back into the ranch yard as the last light of day bled out of the sky, turning the puddles of melting snow into pools of dark, reflective oil. The silence that greeted him wasn't the peaceful quiet of the last month. It was a heavy, expectant stillness. He found Garrick and the women in the barn, the twins mucking out the stalls with a rhythm that suggested they were trying to outrun their own anxiety. When Thorne entered, the air shifted. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gathered them by the feed bin, the smell of sweet hay and old leather grounding the moment. "They know," Thorne said, his voice flat and devoid of sugar-coating. "Holloway knows you're here. He says the clan is coming to collect." He watched the words hit them. Lan went still, her hand flying to her throat, while May's face hardened into a mask of stone, her grip on the pitchfork tightening until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't surprise he saw in their eyes. It was the resignation of people who had spent their entire lives waiting for the other shoe to drop. "We leave," May said sharply, stepping forward. "We go tonight. High pass. We not bring trouble here." She started to move toward the door, her movements jerky and desperate. Thorne caught her arm, not aggressively, but with enough weight to stop her. "There is no 'we go,'" he stated, his voice dropping an octave. "You wouldn't make it 10 miles in this mud, and I don't turn people out. Not to wolves, not to Holloway." Lon stepped closer, placing a hand on May's shoulder, her voice trembling but clear. "It is the superstition," she whispered, looking at the floor. "Twins. Bad omen in our village. 1 is luck, 2 is curse. They throw us away to save the harvest. If we stay, we bring curse to you." Thorne looked at the 2 women, seeing the lifetime of internalized shame they carried. He looked at Garrick, who spat a stream of tobacco juice into the straw and nodded once, a silent affirmation of loyalty. "I've had bad luck all my life," Thorne said, releasing May's arm. "A little more won't kill me, but Holloway might try. We fortify. Tonight." The decision was made. They weren't guests anymore. They were a garrison. The transition from farm work to siege preparation was immediate. They boarded up the lower windows with thick oak planks, leaving only narrow slits for line of sight. They moved the essential supplies, water, dried meat, ammunition, into the main cabin. The atmosphere in the house changed from a home to a bunker, the air thick with the scent of gun oil and nervous sweat. The waiting was a physical torture, a slow erosion of the nerves that made every snapping twig sound like a gunshot. 3 days passed. The thaw continued relentlessly, the world turning into a slurry of brown mud and gray ice. Thorne spent the daylight hours in the loft of the barn, watching the southern approach through a pair of battered field glasses. He watched the hawks circle, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. He watched the wind ripple through the new grass, pushing up through the slush. It was on the 4th afternoon, when the sun was high and mocking in a cloudless sky, that the horizon broke. It wasn't a clan, it was a posse. 6 riders, moving in a loose formation that spoke of arrogance rather than discipline. They wore the long duster coats of hired regulators, the sun glinting off the brass of their rifles. Thorne didn't need to see their faces to know who sent them. Holloway wasn't coming himself. He was sending the cleaners. Thorne whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut across the yard. Below, in the cabin, the door slammed shut and the heavy bar dropped into place. Garrick limped out of the bunkhouse, carrying a double-barreled shotgun, and took up a position behind the water trough. Thorne slid his Winchester through the hayloft door, the cold walnut stock pressing against his cheek. He sighted the lead rider, a man with a red scarf tied around his neck. He didn't fire. Not yet. In the West, you didn't shoot first unless you wanted to hang, but you made damn sure you shot last. The riders stopped at the property line, 50 yards out. "Thorne!" the leader shouted, his voice carrying easily over the open ground. "Mayor says you got some stolen goods. We're here to facilitate a return." Thorne didn't answer. He let the silence stretch, let the horses shift nervously under the riders. Silence was a weapon. It made men think too much. Inside the cabin, May and Lan were huddled beneath the window sills. Lan was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut, muttering prayers in a low, frantic cadence. May was different. She had found a long, sharp skinning knife from the kitchen block and was gripping it with both hands, her eyes fixed on the door, a feral snarl hidden behind her lips. She wasn't praying. She was calculating. Back in the loft, Thorne finally spoke, his voice booming. "Turn around! Private property! Trespassers get buried where they drop!" The leader laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "Don't be a fool, old man. We're deputized. We're coming in." The leader spurred his horse forward. Thorne exhaled, his finger tightening on the trigger. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the dirt right in front of the horse's hooves. Crack! The rifle shot was deafening. The bullet kicked up a geyser of mud, spooking the horse into a violent rear that nearly unseated the rider. It was the line in the sand. The negotiation was over. The skirmish that followed wasn't a glorious battle. It was a messy, chaotic exchange of lead and splinters. The riders scattered, diving behind the cover of the fence line and the scrub brush. Bullets thudded into the logs of the cabin in the barn, sending showers of wood chips flying. Thorne worked the lever of his Winchester, firing methodically, keeping them pinned down. Garrick fired the shotgun, the roar like a cannon, shredding the wooden fence rails. But they were pinned. They were outnumbered, and the sun was going down. Darkness would favor the attackers. Inside the cabin, a bullet smashed through a chink in the log, shattering a clay pitcher on the table. Lan screamed. May grabbed her, pulling her down flat. Then, May did something Thorne hadn't expected. She crawled to the gun rack where Thorne had left a smaller varmint rifle. She had never fired a gun in her life, only watched Thorne clean 'em. She dragged it down, the weight awkward in her small hands. She positioned the barrel through the loophole they had cut. She didn't close her eyes. She looked out at the flashes of muzzle fire in the twilight. She wasn't fighting for property. She was fighting for the right to exist. Night fell like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, bringing with it a terrifying new element: fire. The attackers, frustrated by the stalemate, had resorted to the oldest tactic on the plains. A torch arced through the black sky, a trailing comet of orange sparks, and landed on the roof of the bunkhouse. The dry shingles, even damp from the thaw, caught with a hungry whoosh. "Damn them!" Thorne roared from the loft. He had to move. The barn would be next. He scrambled down the ladder, his knees protesting, and sprinted across the open yard toward the cabin. Bullets zipped past him, angry hornets in the dark. He felt a tug on his sleeve, a graze, nothing more, and slammed into the cabin door. "Open up!" he screamed. The bar lifted and he tumbled inside. The room was dark, lit only by the flashes of gunfire from outside and the ominous orange glow growing through the cracks in the window boards. "They're burning us out," Garrick yelled, limping in from the back door where he had retreated. "Bunkhouse is gone. They're circling around back." Thorne looked at the twins. They were terrified, soot-stained, but they were standing. "We can't stay here," Thorne rasped, reloading his rifle with trembling hands. "If the roof catches, we cook. We have to make a break for the tree line behind the creek." It was a suicide run. Open ground, but staying meant death by fire. "May, Lon, keep your heads down. Garrick, you take point. I'll cover the rear." Thorne kicked the back door open. The heat from the burning bunkhouse was intense, illuminating the yard in a hellish strobe light. They ran. They ran through the mud, the cold air burning their lungs. They were halfway to the trees when a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A rider flanking them. He raised a pistol, leveling it at Lan. Time seemed to slow down. Thorne brought his rifle up, but he was off balance, slipping in the mud. He wouldn't make the shot. Then a sharp crack rang out from beside him. The rider jerked back, his pistol firing harmlessly into the sky, and toppled from his saddle. Thorne spun around. May stood there, the varmint rifle smoking in her hands, the recoil having knocked her onto her backside. She stared at the fallen man, her eyes wide, shock and horror warring with survival instinct. She had saved them. "Move!" Thorne bellowed, grabbing her arm and hauling her up. They crashed into the tree line just as the main cabin roof ignited, a pillar of flame shooting into the night sky. From the safety of the dense pines, they watched their sanctuary burn. The attackers cheered, thinking the occupants were inside. Thorne watched the flames consume the work of a lifetime. He felt a hand slip into his. It was Lan. Then another on his other side. May. They stood in the snow and mud, homeless again, but alive. The rule of 3 hit him. Loss, rage, clarity. The ranch was wood and stone. The family was standing right here. And the night wasn't over. The dawn brought a cold, gray light that revealed the extent of the devastation. The cabin was a smoking husk, the chimney standing like a lonely tombstone. The attackers had ridden off, likely back to town to collect their pay, assuming the job was done. Thorne, Garrick, and the twins huddled in a shallow cave near the creek bed, shivering but resolute. Thorne checked his weapons. He had 12 rounds left. "You 3 stay here," Thorne said, his voice quiet, dangerous. "Garrick, keep the shotgun. If anyone comes back, don't ask questions." May grabbed his coat. "Where you go?" she asked, her voice raspy from smoke. "To finish it," Thorne said. He didn't take a horse. They had scattered in the night. He walked. It was a 5-mile hike to Oak Haven, and with every step, Thorne's fury crystallized into a cold, hard purpose. He wasn't going to kill Holloway. Killing made a man a martyr. He was going to destroy him. Thorne walked into Oak Haven at noon. He was covered in soot, dried blood, and mud, looking like a revenant rising from the grave. The town went silent. People stopped on the boardwalks. The piano in the saloon died. Thorne walked straight to the mayor's office, a brick building that smelled of cigars and complacency. He kicked the door open. Holloway was sitting at his desk, counting a stack of currency. Payment from the clan, no doubt. He looked up, and the color drained from his face. "Thorne," he stammered, reaching for a drawer. Thorne was faster. He vaulted the desk, grabbing Holloway by the lapels and slamming him into the wall. A heavy-framed portrait of the governor crashed to the floor. "You missed," Thorne whispered, his face inches from the mayor's. He dragged Holloway out into the street, throwing him into the mud. A crowd gathered. Shopkeepers, miners, the very people Holloway squeezed for taxes. "Look at him," Thorne roared, pointing at the shivering official. "He burns homes. He attacks women. Is this your law?" Thorne pulled a small, charred ledger from his pocket, the only thing he had saved from the fire besides his gun. It wasn't his ranch ledger. It was one he had found in Holloway's desk just now, lying in plain sight. "He's selling land rights he doesn't own to the railroad," Thorne shouted, improvising based on the maps he saw on the wall. But the fear in Holloway's eyes confirmed it. "He tried to kill us to cover his tracks." The crowd murmured, the mood shifting. The institutional villain had no power without the illusion of order. The 2 gunmen who had ridden with the posse stepped out of the saloon, hands hovering near their guns. Thorne turned to them. "He can't pay you," Thorne said calmly. "I just burned his safe." It was a lie, but in the confusion it worked. The gunman looked at Holloway, looked at the furious rancher, and walked away. Holloway was alone. Thorne left him there in the mud, broken not by a bullet, but by the truth. The seasons in Montana are distinct, violent chapters. Winter kills, spring floods, but summer heals. 3 years had passed since the night of the fire. The ranch had been rebuilt, not as the dark, claustrophobic cabin it once was, but as a sprawling 2-story structure with wide porches and large windows that welcomed the light. The herd had tripled. The scars on the land had been covered by wildflowers and sweetgrass. Thorn sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and violet. He wasn't the same man who had ridden the fence line in a blizzard. The silence in his chest had been filled. Laughter drifted from the corral. May was there, training a new colt. She wore denim and boots, her hair in a loose braid, moving with a confidence that commanded the animal's respect. She spoke to the horse in a mix of English and Cantonese, a language that had become the secret code of the ranch. Lon sat on the porch steps near Thorn, a ledger on her lap. She was the brains of the operation now, managing the accounts with a ruthless efficiency that terrified the local cattle buyers. She looked up, catching Thorn's eye, and smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, devoid of the haunted shadow of the past. Garrick, older and slower but still sharp, was dozing in a rocking chair, a new dog sleeping at his feet. They had forged a life out of the wreckage. The "found family" wasn't just a phrase. It was the steel beam holding the house up. Thorn stood and walked to the railing. He thought about the day he found them, the gray shapes in the snow. He thought about the plea, "Please don't leave us." He realized now that he hadn't just saved them. They had saved him. They had pulled him out of the cold storage of his own grief. He looked out at the vast, enduring landscape. The wind still blew, but it didn't hunt anymore. It just whispered through the grass, carrying the sounds of life, of a legacy that would outlast them all. Thorn took a deep breath of the cool evening air, turned back to his family, and finally, truly, went home.